That's Atone Katz, Rabbi Atone Katz, from his Live in Jerusalem album, singing Elul Nigun. That's his Nigun composed for the month of Elul. That's the last month of the year when we begin to prepare for the days of awe, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And so that's that time of the year when we really think about making the atonement, right? We're preparing for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and you think, okay, who have I harmed in the past year? Against whom did I transgress? For the sins against God, we're going to have to apologize to God, and that's what Yom Kippur is all about. For the sins against other people, we're going to have to apologize to them. And you got to take, in the words of the people involved in 12-step programs, that fearless moral inventory to see who have you harmed, and then be willing to go to them and ask for their forgiveness. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do a beautiful daf from the Talmud, a beautiful page we're going to be learning today, kind of a quick page, I think. Who's with us today? Stephen in New Hampshire, James in Indianapolis, Jennifer in Ocala, Paula in Chicago, Lucy in Minnesota, Tom in PA, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Ann in Merced, Bill in Berkeley, PK in Colorado, John in Lewiston, Maine, Maureen in Central Michigan, Belle in Illinois, Rebecca in LA, Nancy in North Carolina, Sharon in Cape May, and a happy 8th birthday to her granddaughter, Ellie Scott. Renee, shalom from Indy. Eileen is in Mariposa. Patrice in Utah. Paula says, keep singing, Sal. Thank you. Don't ever let a complete lack of talent in singing stop your, impact your enthusiasm for singing. Pauline in Arkansas. Yosef in Massachusetts. Welcome, everybody. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas, Seraphim in Sacramento, Gigi in British Columbia. Yesterday, I shared this week's table for 5. I added for the Jewish Journal. So every week, we bring 5 writers making a commentary on a verse that I've chosen from that week's Torah portion. This week, our Torah portion is Beha'alotecha, or Behaloscha. And the verse from Numbers 8, 17, and 18, it's very connected to what we're doing in the daf. For all the firstborn among the children of Israel are mine, whether man or beast, since the day I smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I have sanctified them for myself. I have sanctified the firstborn to myself, says God. And I have taken the Levites instead of all the firstborn of the children of Israel. So somehow in the wilderness, the tribe of Levi, and I'm one of the Levites, was sanctified to God for some kind of a special role. And yesterday we heard from Dr. Sheila Keeter explain that when you're selected for a job by God, okay, you can say that there's an honor that goes with that and therefore a privilege, but really what you're selected for is service and increased obligation. Today, I'd like to share with you a commentary on the same verse from Rabbi Avraham Greenstein. I used to study Hebrew with Rabbi Avraham. He's a professor of Hebrew, and he says like this: a revelatory idea that emerges from these verses about the sanctification of the firstborn and that the Levites were then taken in place of the firstborn. So a revelatory idea that emerges from these verses is that to be acquired by God is to be made holy. And we say that about God in the daily prayer, that he is the Koneh HaKol, that he acquires, he is the one who acquires everything. Like, it's almost like, what does that mean? God made everything that exists in the universe. So obviously he acquired it. He acquired it because he made it. And yet the Torah singles out this term that God also acquires everything. Now, what does that mean that God acquires? When God saves the firstborn Israelites from the plague of the firstborn, they become his in some kind of special way, and they are thereby sanctified to him. The Levites, who are taken in place of the firstborn, and this is what happened after the sin of the golden calf, that whereas the firstborns in every family had been the ones who were sanctified for a special purpose, and Dr. Keeter yesterday said, well, the first one that is born in a family sort of changes the life of the parents. They become more aware of their responsibilities in the world, and they become less selfish because they become dedicated to their children. And it's the firstborn who sort of, instigate that transformation. And so the firstborn should be selected for service. But the firstborns participated in the sin of the golden calf. So then God said, well, the Levites didn't, so we're going to take the Levites in place of the firstborn. Says Rabbi Abraham, the Levites who are taken in the place of the firstborn are likewise rendered a holy tribe whose only occupation is God's service, right? The Levites don't get land in the Holy Land, so they don't become farmers. Rather, they are dedicated to God's service. This dynamic is also apparent in the language describing the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness, a portable, sanctified space. The verse specifies that the donated offerings of materials for the tabernacle, right? This is the first capital campaign. Moses said to the people, we need stuff to make the tabernacle, and everybody gave more than was expected of them, and they eventually had to tell the people to stop bringing. We've got more than we need to build the tabernacle. It was a successful capital campaign. And the verse specifies that the donated offerings of materials for the tabernacle be, quote, for me, end quote. In other words, specifically for God, so that they become my offerings from God's point of view. They become my offerings, God could say. And the tabernacle gains its holiness by belonging to God, the source and defining principle of all that is holy. What is holy? What does it mean to be holy? It means connected to God in some kind of profound way, right? It's a connection to God who defines. He's the source of holiness, and he's the one that defines what holiness is, and something is holy because it is connected to God in some special way. So in light of this, we must understand the various phrases found in scripture and liturgy asserting God as the possessor of all, the one who acquired all, the owner of all, to mean that all of existence is in fact holy, right? If God defines what is holy because it has some connection to him, okay, but God made the whole universe, so the whole universe is in some way connected to God, so there should be some kind of inherent holiness in everything. And yet the word holy, right, kadosh, means separate, something that has been separated and dedicated to God. So if that's so, how could the whole universe be holy, right? If the things that are holy are somehow separated from what is mundane, what is profane, right? Holy means separated from the mundane for this special connection with God. But if God made the whole universe, doesn't the whole universe possess some level of holiness? That's the question that Rabbi Abraham is asking. So he goes on and he says, so if this is so, what differentiates the pigeons and their perches from the Levites and the tabernacle? The Levites are a high level of holiness. The tabernacle itself, a high level of holiness. The holy temple in Jerusalem, when it was eventually built, a very high level of holiness. So what is it that separates these sanctified, extra holy things from just the animals in nature, from the rocks in the ground, which are all part of a universe created by God? How is the profane world not, in fact, holy? Or how is it holy in such a way that some of it is more holy than the rest? And the answer is that nothing is truly profane except in our recognition of it as such. Everything we experience and come in contact with is holy because it represents a potential mitzvah. Even evil becomes holy in our rejection of it. We must look for opportunities to make the world into God's world, or the way the Lubavitcher Rebbe puts it, we have to make this world a home for God. We must look for opportunities to make the world God's world, to render manifest the holiness inherent in ourselves and in the world around us. So again, what he's working with is this idea that God defines what holiness is. Now, God has told us that some things are holier than others. The Levites are set aside to be more holy, or at least dedicated for a holy service that other Jews are not dedicated for, not set aside for. Certain places are going to be more holy than others. When Jacob has his dream in that ladder that extends into heaven, and he wakes up in the morning and he says, I didn't know that God's presence was here. I didn't know that this place was so holy, was set aside in this way. What made it that way is that he had an experience in that place. So the idea is, what is holy? That which we engage with in order to do God's will. The temple is a holy place because we go there to perform our obligations that can only be performed in the temple, right? And so even something that is evil in the world, some kind of abomination, possesses this potential for holiness because we know that God's will for us is that we don't do that evil, that we reject that evil, that we overcome evil, or that we transform that evil into good. So it has that latent potential, and when we go and do God's will, then we express that holiness in the world. And as Rashi says, it's a pleasing aroma to God because we did what God asked us to do. Let's get into our daf, our page of the Talmud today. This is page Mem Dalet, page 44 here in Tractate Yoma. This is the 6th volume of the Talmud, the Laws of Yom Kippur, particularly as they were practiced when the temple stood, when the tabernacle stood, first in the wilderness and then at Shiloh and a couple other places in Israel. And eventually the first temple was built in Jerusalem. So about 400 years of the tabernacle period, about 400 years of the first temple period, and then about 400 years of the second temple period. And since then, we've observed Yom Kippur in a different way, not by bringing offerings and having the high priest bring those offerings in the holy temple for us on Yom Kippur. Yesterday, we read the third Mishna here in chapter 4. And today we're going to be discussing that Mishnah, reading the Gemara that discusses it. It was a long Mishnah, so just a quick synopsis, that the high priest would slaughter the bull. So there was the procedure of bringing the bull, and he would be assisted by an ordinary priest in collecting the blood from the slaughter so that it could be sprinkled in the proper place, and you would have to keep stirring it. And then there was also some distinctions drawn between how things are done on Yom Kippur and how they're done the rest of the days of the year. On all the other days of the year, the incense is burned on the incense altar, which is in the sanctuary, the holy, right? The sort of first large chamber inside the temple. And that's also where the menorah, the candelabra stood, and the table of the showbreads, and the incense altar. That's on all the other days of the year. But on Yom Kippur, the incense is burned in the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum that only the high priest can enter. How is the incense burned? Right? It's this very fine powder, which on Yom Kippur is super fine. And it's dropped on these burning hot coals. Where do they come from? They come from the fire on the Mizbeach, on the altar that's in the courtyard. And whereas every other day of the year, he would kind of use, an ordinary priest would use a large-ish coal pan made out of silver and then take some of the hot coals and put them in a gold coal pan and then put that on the incense altar in the sanctuary. On Yom Kippur, the high priest would scoop up some coals from the outer altar with the smaller gold pan, a special gold pan that's only used on Yom Kippur, and then he would take those coals inside the temple through the sanctuary to the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum of the sanctuary. And there's another inner incense altar, and there he would put the superfine incense on those coals. So those are some of the differences that we learned in the Mishnah yesterday. today in our Gemara, we're going to be looking at the commentary on that Mishnah. So the Mishnah states that the blood of the bull is stirred by a priest, not stirring it, but rather holding this vessel, this metal vessel that he kind of just swirls the blood in it so it doesn't coagulate, and it has no flat bottom, so the priest who's helping the high priest can't put it down. He has to keep swirling it. And where is that priest standing? He's standing on the fourth row of tiles in the sanctuary while the high priest sacrifices the incense in the Holy of Holies. And the Gemara asks, but is it not written, and there shall be no man in the tent of meeting when he, the priest, goes in to make atonement in the sanctuary until he comes out? That's Leviticus 16:17. How then could the guy stirring the bull's blood be standing in the sanctuary? And Rabbi Yehuda said, amend the Mishnah and teach it as saying the fourth row of tiles of the sanctuary, meaning the fourth row really of the steps leading up to the sanctuary that are outside the sanctuary, right? So this procedure with the bull of Yom Kippur happens in the courtyard outside the sanctuary, happens between the altar and the sanctuary, and then the high priest goes inside the sanctuary while he's doing the incense service, and this other guy just keeps swirling that liquid so that it doesn't coagulate. And where does that guy stand while he's waiting for the high priest to come back out? Not in the sanctuary, but just outside the sanctuary. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, the verse states, and there shall be no man in the tent of meeting when he goes in to make atonement in the sanctuary until he comes out. So the verse prohibits anyone to be inside the tent of meeting during the burning of the incense. Now, I might have thought that nobody should be present, even in the temple courtyard. Therefore, the verse states, in the tent of meeting, limiting this prohibition that no one else should be nearby to the temple itself, or when the tabernacle was standing, to the tent itself. I have derived only that a prohibition exists in the tent of meeting of the tabernacle that was in the desert. From where do I derive that this prohibition, that nobody should be standing nearby when the high priest brings the incense, that no one should be standing nearby once they built the eternal house, meaning the permanent holy temple, the one that Solomon built? That was the first temple, and then later the second temple, which is a permanent structure, as opposed to that portable tent, which was the tabernacle. Maybe this rule that nobody should be nearby when the incense is being brought on the altar only applied in the tabernacle days in the wilderness, or even when the tabernacle was brought into the land of Israel, but not when it was replaced by a permanent structure. Therefore, the verse states, in the sanctuary, indicating that the prohibition applies to any sanctuary, whether it's in the tabernacle or in the eternal house. Now, I have derived only that a prohibition exists during the burning of the incense. From where do I derive that the prohibition applies also during the presentations of the bull's blood in the Holy of Holies? And the verse states, when he goes in to make atonement. And atonement is achieved through the presentations of blood. There's a sprinkling of the blood that's done in a particular way. We're going to be learning about that later as we go through that sort of chronological order. We've been sort of going through the rituals of Yom Kippur, and eventually we'll get to where he actually sprinkles the blood of the bull. But now we're just learning that nobody else, no other priest can be nearby when he makes those presentations of the blood. Now, I have derived only that a prohibition exists from the time of his entrance into the Holy of Holies. From where is it derived that the prohibition remains in force until he exits the Holy of Holies? And the verse states, until he comes out. So the Baraisa concludes by expounding the final part of the verse from Leviticus 16:17. Right? So the first part was, and there shall be no man in the tent of meeting when he goes in to make atonement in the sanctuary until he comes out and have made atonement for himself and for his household and for all the assembly of Israel. So now the Baraisa concludes by looking at this last part of the verse and have made atonement for himself and for his household and for all the assembly of Israel. And this teaches that his atonement precedes, comes before, or is followed by the atonement of his household, right? His personal atonement is followed by the atonement that he makes for his household, his wife, his family. And that is followed by the atonement that he makes for all the assembly of Israel. Which act of atonement is the same for him and for his household and for his brethren, the priests, and for the entire community of Israel? You must say that this is... Oh, wait a minute. I skipped something. Hold on. Let me go back up. So this teaches that his atonement is followed by the atonement of his household, and the atonement of his household is followed by the atonement of his brethren, the priests, and the atonement of his brethren, the priests, is followed by the atonement of the entire community of Israel. The Gemara analyzes the Baraisa. And the master said in the Baraisa, I have derived only that a prohibition against other people being in the vicinity, exactly where he is, during the burning of the incense. From where in the verse could this have been inferred? That really there's going to be, some privacy requirements when he's sprinkling the blood, but there's greater privacy requirements for the priest when he's bringing the incense. From where is that derived? Rava said, and similarly Rabbi Yitzhak bar Avdimi said, and similarly Rabbi Elazar said. The conclusion of that verse states, and have made atonement for himself and for his household and for all the assembly of Israel. Which act of atonement is the same for him and for his household and for his brethren, the priests, and for the entire community of Israel? You must say that this is the burning of the incense. How do we know that? Because the slaughter of the bull of the high priest on Yom Kippur is not for the community of Israel, for the population of Israel. The bull atones for himself, for his family, and for his brethren, the other priests, right? They're all descendants of Aaron. But the incense makes an atonement for him, for his family, for the priests, and for all of Israel. Klal Yisrael, Am Yisrael, the whole nation of Israel. Now, the Gemara right away asks, does incense affect atonement? Normally we learn that what is the part of an offering that creates an atonement? What is the part of a sin offering that creates an atonement, scores an atonement, as it were, right? That affects atonement for the one bringing the offering. It's the blood, right? Because it's the life blood that comes out of the animal when it's slaughtered. And then you take that blood, which it's very sacred, right? That it was the life of the animal. And so you're being very mindful when we don't have animal sacrifices anymore. It's so foreign to our sensitivities. But when animal sacrifices existed in the ancient world, it was the most common type of religious observance there was. Everyone in the world brought offerings. That's what they did because the animals were so valuable to them in an agricultural society, an agrarian society. So when they brought an animal, it was a really big deal. And the life of that animal could be sort of symbolized, the most precious part of the life was in that life blood, the first blood that spurts out when it was slaughtered. And that's what affects the atonement. But now we're learning that the incense, putting that fine incense on the coals, which creates this beautiful, fragrant cloud that people enjoy, right? It's not what you're giving up when you burn the incense. It's like a gift that you share with God. It's some kind of pleasing aroma to God, not because God needs our perfumed incense smell, but because God asked us to do it and we did it. And it is definitely a pleasing aroma to us who has a sense of smell and enjoy nice aromas, right? So why is it that bringing incense affects atonement for the whole nation? Does incense affect atonement? The Torah mentions the concept of atonement only with regard to offerings. Yes, as Rabbi Hanania teaches in a Baraisa, yes, incense affects atonement. How do we know? We learned of the incense that it affects atonement, as it is stated, and he put on the incense and made atonement for the people. That's Numbers 17:12. And the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, for what reason does incense affect atonement? For what reason? For what does incense, Rabbi Yishmael, and the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, for what does incense affect atonement? Meaning, what kind of sins are atoned for by the bringing of the incense? It's not some kind of general atonement. It doesn't atone for all sins, right? The idea is that the bull, for example, of the high priest, that comes for a specific reason. That comes for mistakes that were made when the priest or his family or the other priests, who are the priests, and the priests have special obligations. Only they can eat of the holy foods, the teruma. Other people can't eat it at all. But if a priest eats the holy food when he is in a state of ritual impurity, when he's tameh, that's a transgression. Or if a priest enters the temple when he is in a state of ritual impurity, or the food became ritually impure and he ate it anyway. For mistakes like that, transgressions like that, the bull makes an atonement. Also, the sitz that he wears on the front plate that he wears all year, that makes an atonement for certain mistakes that are made with regard to the offerings brought by the priests in the temple. What does the incense atone for? Says the school of Rabbi Yishmael, for slander. Speaking lashon hara about other people. Speaking with an evil tongue, malicious reports about other people. Now, slander in American legal parlance would suggest that you said something false about other people, and that you hurt them that way. You inflicted damage on them, on their reputation that actually has financial repercussions because you spoke falsehood about them. Slander here has a little bit more of a broader understanding that even if you said something that is true but shouldn't have been said about them, something that's harmful to their reputation, revealed secrets about people, that you spoke badly about others. Why is the incense connected to the sin of slander? Says the school of Rabbi Yishmael, let something that is done in secret, in other words, we've just been learning that when the incense offering is brought, no other priest can be inside with the high priest. In fact, they have to back off. There has to be a distance between them and where he is, either in the sanctuary, bringing incense on the incense altar on every other day of the year, or when he's in the Holy of Holies, he's alone, right? So when he brings the incense, he's alone. On every day of the year, he's alone in the sanctuary, and on Yom Kippur, he's alone in the Holy of Holies. Why is that connected to slander? Let something that is done in secret come and effect atonement for an act that is done in secret. How is most slander spread? How is most calumny spread? In secret, right? We whisper to our friends and we talk about mutual friends or mutual acquaintances or other people, right? And it's that whisper campaign, that speaking lashon hara, speaking with a wicked tongue about others. It's almost always done in secret. Slander is usually not the way it's being defined here. It's not a public action. It's done in secret. So let this particular offering, the incense offering that is done privately, atone for the sin that is conducted privately. We skip down quite a ways to the middle of the B side of page 44. I'm not going to do all the derivations of exactly how they know that the priest needs to be alone when he's bringing the incense offerings. Now we skip down. The Mishna states, on every other day, a priest would scoop up the coals with a coal pan made of silver and pour the coals, and I'm almost done, so if you have questions and comments, get them in there, into the comments. On every other day, a priest would scoop up the coals with a coal pan made of silver and pour the coals from there into a smaller coal pan made of gold. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason that the gold pan was not used initially to scoop the coals? And the Gemara answers Because the Torah spared the money of the Jewish people. Since the coal pan is worn away with use, you can imagine scraping hot coals off of the altar, which is the altar itself made out of rough stone. So that's going to wear away a soft metal like silver or gold. So the Torah understands these things are expensive, and let's use the less expensive metal, the silver, over the coal pan that on a daily basis, morning and afternoon, is going to be scraping hot coals off the altar. And then transfer those coals to the gold pan so that when it's actually placed on the incense altar, it's done with great honor and dignity and ceremony. But we don't need such honor and dignity and ceremony for scraping hot coals off the altar. So then for what reason, what is the reason that on Yom Kippur, so the Mishnah continues, but on this day, on Yom Kippur, the high priest scoops up with a coal pan of gold. He scoops from the altar the hot coals initially with a gold pan on Yom Kippur, and bring the coals in that gold coal pan all the way into the Holy of Holies. And so the Gemara asks, what is the reason that on Yom Kippur only one pan is used? Due to the weakness of the high priest, since he has to perform the entire service by himself while fasting, because it's Yom Kippur, using only one pan minimizes his exertion, right? So by not having to make transfers from one pan to the other, and because it's just one day a year and a very special day, Yom Kippur, we're not going to be too concerned about using that higher value, specially dedicated gold coal pan to actually do the initial scraping up of the coals on the outer altar. The Mishnah, now I'm skipping to near the bottom of page 44b, and the Mishnah states, on every other day, the coal pan was heavy, but on this day, it was light. So that's in keeping with the same idea. We're going to spare the strength of the high priest, who could be a very old man and who's fasting. So let's not tax him too much with the effort. And so it was taught in a baraisa on every other day. Its side, the coal pan's side, was thick, but on this day it was soft and thin. On every other day, its handle was short, but on this day it was long. What is the reason? So that the arm of the high priest could assist him in carrying the coal pan. It's like he could wrap his whole arm around it. It's going to be easier to carry it than just that shorter handle, which is going to be a greater weight on his wrists and on his grip in his hand. And so he could support the coal pan by resting it against his arm rather than bear the entire weight in his hand. And finally, it was taught in a baraisa, on every other day, it did not have a ring. But on this day, it has a ring on the end of the handle, which clatters against it, and it makes a noise in fulfillment of the verse, Exodus 28:35, and the sound thereof shall be heard when he goes into the sanctuary. This is the statement of the son of the deputy, meaning the deputy high priest, right? So we have this idea, we want to know that he's alive. Nobody can enter there, and it's scary. If the high priest is in some way unprepared for his encounter with the divine, if he's not in a state of holiness, a state of purity, a state of preparation, a spiritually elevated state, if he's, unsuited for the job of entering the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, he could die in there, and it happened. And then if he did die in there, well, that's like when a mountain climber dies at the top of Mount Everest. Like, no one can go up there to get him and bring the body down. So only the high priest can enter on Yom Kippur. And even he wasn't pure enough to survive the ordeal. So how's anybody else going to go in there and fetch the body? And that's why it was taught in other places that they would actually have a rope tied to his ankle in case, God forbid, he died in there. They could, pull him out without actually themselves entering the Holy of Holies. So they want to know he's alive in there. And so that special dedicated gold coal pan with which he brings in the coals to burn the incense inside the Holy of Holies has like a clattering ring on its handle so that you can hear him moving around in there and the people would know that the high priest is still alive. All right, that's what I've got for us today. Let us go to comments and questions. Right. So we talked earlier about this idea that Abraham Greenstein brought down, that the whole world possesses some measure of holiness, yet God has introduced gradations, right? That the temple is going to be a holier place than others, the priests are going to be holier than other people, the Levites are going to be holier than other people, but not as holy as the priests. And so Seraphim asks, are impure animals also holy according to this explanation? Yes, I mean, of course, right? So there's this idea that, first of all, in terms of a Jew, what we're permitted to eat, a Jew is not permitted to eat non-kosher animals by Torah law, right? So there's a definition of which animals constitute kosher animals, right? Now, that's not actually a measure of holiness, although we fulfill God's will by following the laws of kashrus, right? What is kosher and what isn't. And it takes a lot of planning and preparation and work and sacrifice, right? Nina and I are Baalei Teshuva, so like we came back to Judaism, we became religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, and one of the things that we gave up, was the ability to go to any wonderful restaurant that everybody raves about, and you read wonderful reviews in the newspapers, and everybody's talking about the new restaurant. Yeah, we can't go there. We can't go there. It's not a kosher restaurant, so we can't eat there. It's a big loss, all right? And all the people who can go into those restaurants, you should have such great meals. I'm so happy for you that you can have such wonderful food from wonderful chefs, and you should enjoy it with relish and with gusto. But we can't, because what can we do? Our Father in heaven said, that's not for you. There are some wonderful kosher restaurants. Now, but when you talk about these impure animals, so first of all, the animals that are brought as offerings, they are kosher animals. But can we say that a lobster is holy? Okay, now a Jew can't eat a lobster. A non-Jew can, absolutely. What is holy about the lobster? Well, according to Rabbi Abraham, what's holy about the lobster is when the Jew makes a choice not to eat it, it was an opportunity to create holiness in the world by fulfilling God's decree, and he took it. Now, a non-Jew is permitted to eat lobster, but he is not permitted to cut a leg off a living lobster and then eat it, right? You got to kill the lobster before you cook it and start eating it. You can't take a limb off a living animal and eat that. That's a violation of one of the Noahide laws. Now, I know in certain cultures they do that, but according to the Torah, no, you can't do that. You have to first kill the animal and then you can eat its limbs and not before. So, following God's will in those situations is an opportunity for holiness, which we can seize. And when we do that, it refines ourselves and it refines the world. And eventually, when there's enough refinement in the world, well, then, God willing, the Messiah will come. And, we can sort of hasten the coming of Mashiach by making this repair in the world by doing God's will. Tom Beck, we still treat the blood of a shechted animal with care. The shochet has to drain it all out. That's right. So now when we're talking about kosher animals that we eat, there are very stringent rules about how a kosher animal is slaughtered, and then how it's butchered and what we eat of it. There are parts of the cow that we're not allowed to eat, even though the cow is permitted to us. The slaughtering itself is about as quick and painless as possible, given that the cow is giving up its life. I understand for vegetarians and for vegans, the whole idea is distasteful, but now we're speaking in the world of meat-eating people. Nevertheless, it has to be slaughtered a certain way, and that blood, we're not casual about it. We're not cavalier about it. We understand that the animal, was given to us to eat, but we're very grateful, we're very thankful, and we treat the animal with respect, and its blood is handled in a very certain way. It has to be poured out. Some of it is poured out on the ground, and then that has to be covered up with dirt, and almost like it's returning to the dirt that it came from. John Pittman, how was the Holy of Holiest kept clean? And Bill answered, a maintenance person was lowered in from the roof wearing blinders, so he didn't look anywhere but what he was cleaning. Exactly. Isn't that fascinating? We had that, it must have been in was it in Shekalim or in Erevin? We talked about it earlier in our journey, and this idea that, yes, there was maintenance done in the Holy of Holies, but they would not go through the curtains that are in front of it, which only the high priest enters on Yom Kippur. Rather, some kind of maintenance man would come through the roof in like a box, right? So that the walls acted as blinders for him, and he could only see what was directly in front of him, the repair that he had to make, and nothing else. And he would keep his eyes off the Ark of the Covenant and whatever else is in the Holy of Holies, which we spoke about at another time. Lucy. Incense, like Lashon Hara, also penetrates everywhere, changes the atmosphere, etc. Right, so the incense sort of atones for this sin of speech, slanderous speech, or more generally Lashon Hara, right? And it's like, you know, that old story of, well, when you commit a slander against someone, when you speak Lashon Hara of someone, those words are just released into the world. You can't get them back. It's like you take a feather pillow and release it in the wind. You can never get all those feathers back in the pillow. The incense also, it permeates the air, right? An offering, okay, you know, you put some blood on the altar, maybe all the animal is burned on the altar, maybe some of it is eaten, but it's sort of like contained. The incense, you know, it just goes everywhere, and you can't bring it back, and it's a good lesson. It's something that happens in private and then, you know, sort of goes out eventually to the four corners of the universe. Bill, now this is a thing that continues to puzzle me about Lashon Hara. That is, that what one is saying is true is not necessarily a defense. How would this square with, say, an investigative journalist revealing that a powerful person has done something highly unethical but technically legal? Is it that it's public that makes that okay, or is that still Lashon Hara? Right, so we're really commanded not to speak about other people. Right, so it's the Chafetz Chaim that really elaborated the laws of Lashon Hara. Rabbi Israel Meir Kagan. And what he said was that really the only time that's permitted to speak about people in this public way is when you're going to protect the public from this person, right? So if somebody's like some kind of serial predator, of course you expose that person so he won't have the opportunity to harm other people. He won't have, so other victims won't fall in the path of that evil, of that wickedness. You know, so if you're talking about something that's very unethical, there's probably a victim, right? And so, you know, there was a victim. We don't want there to be other victims. So then there's going to be a carve out of these laws that we don't speak about, you know, don't speak ill of people. This is necessary. But we're still going to be careful, because the question always has to be asked, is it necessary? Or really, are we just whispering because it's entertaining to us, because it'll make us seem interesting in a conversation when we bring some juicy tidbit to share with the other people in the conversation? That's the question we have to be honest about. Yosef, Kippur, as I understand it, means to cover like a kippah. In what sense is atonement covering for a better year, keeping from exile, or does it have anything to do with a share in the world to come as well? And I thought that the root KPR, Kuf Pei Resh, was the root meaning atonement, Kapar Lanu. That's Tom's answer. Yeah. Kippur, I don't think is related to cover. It's interesting. It's sort of like a little similar to the English in that sense, but I don't think Kippur is related to a kippah. The word Pur is related to Purim, right? See, Yom Kippur is the day of the lots. The lots? The lottery. What lottery? The lottery of the goats, right? The two goats. One for Azazel and one to be slaughtered in the sanctuary. That's why it's the day of the lots. There's an atonement that is made on this day of the lottery, right? Yom HaKippurim. And that's why it actually the day of the lots with respect to the scapegoat and the goat slaughtered there. Of course it is a day of atonement. And a kapara, and that is a related word, right, is what you bring as an atonement, an offering that is made as an atonement, a sacrifice that is brought for the purpose of making an atonement, right? But the kapara is the offering. And offerings are made on that day to bring atonement, and so that's that's how that works, as far as I know. In terms of Kippur meaning cover, I'm not aware of that connection. Maybe there's another related word, but I'm just not aware of it. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. For page 45, and I think tomorrow we'll be announcing more formally the Shabbos challenge, right? So if you're a Jew, and you're not already completely Shomer Shabbos, think about upping your observance a little bit on Shabbos. If you're not disconnecting from technology, turning off the phone and the screens, give it a try. It's such a wonderful way to reset that inner compass. Even if you're not Jewish, you're not obligated in Shabbos, but unplugging from technology, from all the texting and the buzzing and the WhatsApp and the news and the bad news and the good news and the worst news and all that stuff and the social media and all the intrusion and the ba. Unplugging from that, from Friday evening till Saturday evening, it will just let your soul breathe. And in fact, neshama, the word for soul, is related to the word for breath. Your soul needs a breath once a week. So think about taking on the Shabbos challenge, maybe even this week, doing something you hadn't done already. Are you lighting Shabbos candles if you're a Jewish woman? Are you making a kiddush? Are you making a motzi if you're a Jewish man? Are you praying on Shabbos? Are you connecting with the source of all life and the source of all souls in the universe? Are you taking a moment to say, where am I in my life? Where am I headed? What am I doing? Where have I been? Where am I going? This kind of thinking is what you want to engage in on Shabbos. So the Shabbos challenge begins this week. All the best.